She held out her wedding ring, asking only for bread, but the farmer said words that changed her life forever. See what happened next. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The prairie stretched wide beneath the pale spring sun, its endless grasses shimmering like a restless sea. For days Eliza had walked across this barren expanse, her feet blistered inside worn boots, her dress torn at the hem, her bonnet stained with dust. Hunger had long ago dulled her senses, turning her thoughts into a single refrain. Keep moving. Each step forward was an act of will, each mile a test against her own failing body. She had nothing left but the stubborn spark of survival, a small bundle tied in a threadbare shawl, and the simple gold ring that glimmered faintly on her finger whenever sunlight caught it. That ring, her husband's last gift before fever had claimed him, was the only remnant of a life that already felt as if it belonged to another woman. Her husband's death had been cruel in its swiftness. One day Thomas had been standing behind the counter of their small store in Missouri, arranging bolts of cloth and weighing flour for neighbors. The next, he was bedridden, shivering and burning at once, his skin pale and eyes hollow. Within weeks he was gone, leaving her alone with debts she could not repay. The bank had been quick to seize what little remained, and soon Eliza found herself cast into the world with no roof, no money, and no kin to turn to. She had wandered from town to town, clutching the ring as though its presence might somehow conjure a loaf of bread, only to hear the same cold refusals. Gold was of little use when men wanted labor. By the time she reached the outskirts of Harper Land, her body was little more than skin drawn tightly over bone. She had not eaten a proper meal in days, surviving on stale crumbs and creek water. Still, there had been whispers along the road. The Harpers owned a broad spread of land, cattle and horses enough to need hands, and perhaps, just perhaps, a place for one desperate woman who was not afraid of toil. That thought had been her beacon, carrying her through nights spent shivering under the stars and mornings when her legs threatened to collapse before she could even rise. From a low ridge, she saw it at last. The valley opened wide before her, dotted with buildings, corrals, smoke rising from chimneys, figures moving steadily against the horizon. The sight nearly buckled her knees. Civilization, food, shelter, so near she could almost smell it. The ache in her stomach twisted sharper with longing. She pressed her palm against the gold band, feeling its familiar circle, and whispered a silent promise to the memory of Thomas. This ring would remain with her, even if she had to trade away every ounce of her pride. The dirt path wound downward toward the ranch yard, where men were driving cattle and hauling fence posts. Their shouts mingled with the clatter of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels, filling the air with the sounds of labor. Dust swirled around her skirts as she stepped onto the packed earth, and every eye seemed to turn toward her. A gaunt woman in a travel-stained dress, with hair escaping her bonnet and cheeks hollow from hunger. She must have looked more beggar than lady, yet she straightened her shoulders, summoning the last reserve of dignity that had not yet been stripped away. The effort lasted only a heartbeat. Her body betrayed her, sagging under exhaustion, and before she realized it, she was sinking to her knees in the dirt. The words spilled out of her in a rush, broken by tremors she could not control. She begged not for charity but for labor, pleaded to be taken on as a cook, a laundress, a maid, anything at all. Her voice wavered, yet underneath it throbbed the iron will of a woman who refused to lie down and die on the open prairie. The ranch hands exchanged glances, some mocking, some uncomfortable, a few curious. To them, women were scarce and work was constant, but this thin stranger seemed more likely to collapse than to lift a pot. One or two snickered and heat flooded her face, but she did not rise from her knees. She pressed her palms into the dust and kept her gaze steady on the broad-shouldered figure emerging from the corral. It was the younger Harper's son, Daniel, tall and lean, his shirt clinging to him with the sweat of labor. His green eyes studied her without haste, as though he were weighing more than just her words. Moments later, an older man joined them, his gray hair visible beneath a weathered hat, his features carved by years of wind and work. Jacob Harper, the patriarch of the ranch, stopped beside his son and took in the scene without expression. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the restless shifting of cattle in the pens. Eliza's heart pounded in her ears, her body trembling with fatigue, yet she forced herself to speak once more, offering the only thing she had left: herself, her labor, her endurance. At length Jacob gave a single nod. The decision was not softened by sympathy nor hurried by impatience. It was simply made, as though he had decided where to drive a fence line. She would be given a trial. The younger Harper extended a hand and with surprising gentleness lifted her from the dirt. The warmth of his grip startled her, steadying her as much as his strength. For the first time in weeks, she was not falling, but rising. They led her toward the house, a broad structure with a wide porch and smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, however, the heart of the home told a harsher story. The kitchen was in disarray, pots blackened with soot, pans warped from careless use, shelves dusty and cluttered with spoiled food. The smell of scorched beans lingered thickly in the air, and a pile of unwashed dishes filled the sink. Eliza stood in the doorway, taking in the chaos, and understood that this was not merely a task, but a test. If she could not tame this room, she would have no place here. A narrow chamber adjoining the kitchen was shown to her, a converted pantry with a cot, a washstand, and little else. It would serve as her quarters. To Eliza, it was a palace compared to sleeping on bare earth. She placed her small bundle on the cot, the ring still warm on her finger, and returned to confront the kitchen. Her body screamed for rest, but she knew that weakness would end her chances before they began. With sleeves rolled to her elbows, she filled a bucket from the pump and began scrubbing. The rough boards scraped her knuckles raw. The heavy pots weighed down her thin arms, but she refused to stop. Dust gave way to polished wood, grease to clean iron. By nightfall she had cleared the worst of it, her back bent and muscles aching, but her spirit steadier than it had been in months. When at last she collapsed onto the cot, exhaustion pressed her down like a stone, yet a small flame burned inside. She had not been turned away. She had not been left to die alone on the road. Tomorrow would bring more toil, harsher judgment from the men, but tonight she had walls around her, a roof overhead, and the faint hope of bread in the morning. For the first time since Thomas's death, she allowed herself to believe that survival was possible. As the prairie night settled outside, coyotes calling in the distance, and the stars stretching endless overhead, Eliza touched the gold band on her finger. It was no longer a symbol of what she had lost, but of what she still carried within. She whispered a silent vow into the darkness. She would endure, she would rise, and she would make herself worthy of this place. The ranch was quiet around her, save for the creak of timbers and the low murmur of wind. Somewhere in the yard, horses shifted in their stalls, and the faint smell of hay drifted through the small window. Eliza closed her eyes, too weary for fear, and let the rhythm of the prairie lull her into sleep. Dawn would come quickly, and with it the demand for proof that she belonged. The men would expect hot coffee and hearty food, and she had little but her skill and determination to give. Yet beneath the exhaustion stirred something she had not felt in a long time, a sense of direction. The path ahead was steep and uncertain, but at least it was a path. In that narrow room, wrapped in her threadbare shawl, she dreamed not of Missouri, nor of what had been taken from her, but of the work waiting in the morning, of bread to be baked, of a chance to stand tall again. The woman who had fallen to her knees at the gate was not gone. She would always carry that moment, but she had risen, and in that rising lay the first step toward a new life on the unforgiving yet strangely promising land of the Harpers. The first light of dawn crept across the prairie, painting the land in muted shades of gray before the sun rose in its fierce brilliance. Eliza stirred before the rooster crowed, as if some deep instinct warned her that today would decide much of her fate. The cot in her narrow pantry felt both a blessing and a reminder of her precarious place. She rose quickly, washed her face in cold water that stung against her skin, and tied her hair back with determined fingers. She had no time for hesitation. The ranch would wake soon, and they would expect food, order, and competence. If she faltered, she knew the chance she had been given might vanish as swiftly as it had come. The kitchen loomed before her, both familiar from the night before, and still daunting in its disarray. Though she had scrubbed until her arms trembled, dust lingered on shelves and the heavy iron stove loomed like a beast demanding to be tamed. She coaxed the fire back to life from embers left smoldering overnight, her hands awkward at first, then more sure as the flames caught. She remembered watching her mother knead dough in Ohio, remembered the patient rhythm of flour, water, and salt. It had been years since she last cooked for more than herself and her husband, but necessity sharpened old knowledge. Soon the smell of coffee rising from the pot filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of smoke. Boots thudded on the porch as the men assembled, voices low and impatient. She felt her heart tighten but pressed on. Biscuits browned in the oven, potatoes sizzled in the pan, and salt pork fried until its fat hissed. She arranged the food on the scarred wooden table just as the door opened and the ranch hands filed in. Their expressions were wary, some openly skeptical, others merely curious. They had expected, perhaps, burnt beans and bitter coffee, but the sight of a proper meal drew them to their seats with surprising order. At first, silence reigned. The men ate with the caution of those not used to being surprised by food, but soon the silence broke into low murmurs of approval. Eliza kept her head down, serving more coffee, gathering empty plates, ignoring the sidelong glances and half-smiles. When Jacob Harper entered and took his place at the head of the table, he studied her without comment, then split open a biscuit and nodded once. It was not praise, but it was acknowledgement, and it steadied her more than a dozen compliments. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm. She rose before dawn, worked until her body screamed, and fell asleep the moment she touched her cot. The men, rough and unpolished, often tested her patience. They trailed mud into the house, left dirty dishes in careless heaps, demanded more food than she could prepare in the time she had. Some laughed when she scolded them, others shrugged indifferently, as though daring her to protest. Yet she persisted. With each passing day, she grew sharper in her orders, firmer in her expectations. Slowly, grudgingly, the men began to obey. Cleaning the kitchen became her first victory. She scrubbed until the stove gleamed, boiled linens until the water turned black, and beat dust from rugs until her arms ached. The air shifted gradually, the heavy smell of stale smoke and grease giving way to fresher scents of bread and herbs. She discovered an abandoned garden behind the house, choked with weeds but still hiding stubborn shoots of life. Kneeling in the soil, she pulled until her hands blistered, uncovering rows where vegetables had once grown. It gave her a sense of purpose beyond the kitchen, a chance to restore not only the household but the spirit of the place. The men noticed, though few spoke of it. They returned from the fields to find the table laden, not just with beans and salt pork, but with stews rich with onions and potatoes, cornbread baked golden, and pies filled with wild berries she had gathered herself. Their laughter grew warmer in the evenings, their teasing less sharp. Even Billy, the tow-headed boy who often made light of everything, fell into the habit of fetching water or chopping kindling without being asked. It was respect in the form of action, and Eliza accepted it quietly, knowing words were rare currency among such men. Yet it was not only the workers who changed. Eliza herself began to feel her spirit shift. When she had first come, desperation had bowed her shoulders and filled her eyes with hopelessness. Now, though her body remained thin and her hands rough, she carried herself with a steadiness that surprised even her. She no longer felt like a woman begging for scraps of mercy, but like one who earned her place with every dish set upon the table, every room made clean, every task finished. Pride, once thought a luxury, returned in small but vital ways. Daniel Harper was often present at the edges of her labor. He offered to fetch water, to chop wood, to mend broken shelves. At first she waved off his help, unwilling to appear weak, but gradually she allowed it, finding his quiet competence an anchor in the storm of endless work. He spoke little, yet his eyes lingered, not with pity but with a kind of steady regard that unsettled her more than scorn ever could. It reminded her that she was not invisible, that her efforts were seen and valued, though no grand speeches declared it. Challenges remained constant. Some of the older hands resisted change, grumbling when she enforced rules about keeping the kitchen clean or bringing their plates back washed. One in particular, Hank, mocked her cooking loudly enough to draw laughter, though his plate was always empty by the end of supper. Eliza endured the barbs in silence, knowing that argument would only fuel their amusement. Instead, she let her work speak, and over time even Hank's tone softened, though he would never admit as much. Her body hardened under the labor. Calluses formed where, once her hands had been soft, her back grew stronger from lifting pots and buckets, and her face lost the gauntness of starvation as the steady meals she cooked included enough for herself. Her cheeks filled slightly, her eyes regained a glimmer of life, and she found that she no longer recognized the woman who had collapsed on the dirt before the gates. That woman still lived within her memory, a reminder of how far she had fallen, but she was no longer defined by that moment. Evenings became a strange comfort. After the dishes were washed and the kitchen cleaned, she often sat by the small window of her pantry, looking out at the vast sky where stars shone in their countless thousands. Missouri had known stars too, but not like these, not so sharp and endless. The prairie night made her feel both small and infinite, as though grief and hardship could be stretched thin and remade into something bearable beneath such a sky. She would touch the gold ring then, not with the anguish of loss, but with the quiet strength of one who had survived another day. Slowly, the ranch began to change around her. The men were more punctual at meals, less careless in their habits. The house smelled of food and soap instead of neglect. Daniel's father, Jacob, though still stern, offered her longer glances of approval. The rhythm of work had carved her into something new, and in doing so, it carved the ranch into something steadier as well. She had not yet found belonging, not truly. She remained cautious, aware that her place depended on her labor and her ability to endure. But there were moments when Billy grinned over fresh biscuits, when Samuel muttered that her stew was the best he had tasted since his mother's table, when Daniel quietly carried a heavy pail so she would not strain her back, when she felt that perhaps this land was less strange than it had been. In those moments, she sensed that respect, once withheld, was beginning to take root. It grew not from pity nor charity, but from the soil of work, watered by her determination, warmed by her refusal to surrender. She had come on her knees, but she was standing now, and each passing day strengthened her legs. The prairie was teaching her its harsh lessons, stripping away softness, demanding sweat and resilience. Yet in return, it gave her something she had thought forever lost, the possibility of life beyond survival. Each sunrise brought new toil, each sunset new exhaustion, but within that cycle she discovered dignity. The woman who had begged for work was still inside her, but now she was also the woman who commanded a kitchen, who tamed disorder into order, who planted seeds in barren soil and saw them sprout green. And though she did not yet know it, this new strength would soon be tested by forces beyond burnt pots and stubborn men. Shadows were gathering on the horizon, whispers of conflict that would demand more of her than she had ever given. But for now, she slept each night with the satisfaction of labor done, the faint taste of bread on her tongue, and the knowledge that she had begun to carve a place for herself on this unforgiving land. Summer settled over the prairie with a weight that pressed down on every living thing, its days long and searing, its nights filled with the distant hum of insects and the restless calls of coyotes. For weeks, Eliza had moved within the steady rhythm of the ranch, her place no longer uncertain, her work no longer doubted. The men who had once laughed now brought her firewood without complaint or fetched buckets from the pump before she even asked. Jacob Harper no longer regarded her as a passing burden, but as part of the household, while Daniel's quiet glances carried an unspoken respect that gave her strength in her hardest hours. She felt herself growing into this life, hardened and yet strangely softened too, as though the ranch was shaping her into someone both resilient and alive. But with the warmth of summer also came the first whispers of threat. At first it was small things, easy to dismiss as chance. A fence line cut clean through, though no cattle had wandered far. A gate left swinging open that no hand admitted to leaving unlatched. A horse spooked at night, its cries waking the bunkhouse until the men discovered nothing but shadows beyond the corral. These incidents were troubling, but the ranch was large, and mistakes were common when long hours blurred together. Eliza heard the men mutter about careless work, about green hands not pulling their weight, But she noticed the way Daniel's eyes narrowed, and Jacob's jaw grew tight each time another problem was reported. The unease grew heavier with each passing week. One morning, the men returned from checking the northern pastures with news that made the house fall into silence. A water hole had been fouled, a dead coyote thrown into it, poisoning the supply for the cattle that grazed nearby. That was no accident, no misstep of tired workers. It was malice, plain and deliberate. The name that came up around the supper table was one Eliza had already heard in passing the Double Bar Ranch, owned by Clayton Mason. Mason's reputation stretched across the county like a shadow. He was known to hunger for more land than he owned, to expand his empire not by hard labor, but by intimidation and deceit. Smaller ranches had been driven out or swallowed whole, their owners left broken while Mason's herds grew fat. Harper Land, with its access to reliable water and its fertile pastures, had long been the envy of many, and it seemed Mason was now making his move. Eliza listened in silence as the men debated what to do, her hands busy ladling stew into bowls, her ears sharp to every word. Some argued they should meet force with force, ride out and confront Mason's men directly. Others warned that Mason was too powerful, his influence too wide. Daniel, his face set with grim patience, counseled caution. They could not fight shadows, he said. To ride against Mason without proof would be to play into his hands. Jacob agreed, though the weight in his voice betrayed how heavily the threat pressed upon him. Still, Eliza could feel the strain in the air each day that followed. The men returned later and later from their rides, tempers short, bodies exhausted. The bunkhouse, once filled with laughter, grew quiet in the evenings, the low murmur of talk often broken by sharp words. Even in the house she felt it, the way Jacob lingered longer over his coffee, the way Daniel's gaze flicked often toward the horizon, as though expecting trouble to crest the hills at any moment. Through it all, she did what she knew best. She kept the hearth alive. She rose earlier still, made sure the coffee was stronger, the food heartier, the kitchen cleaner than ever. She scolded and encouraged, pushed and coaxed, until the men, worn though they were, found strength in the meals she set before them and the order she demanded inside the walls of the house. It was not a warrior's role, but it was one just as vital, to bind together spirits fraying under pressure, to remind them of the comfort of stability when the world outside sought to unravel it. The first open act of violence came on a moonless night. Eliza woke to the sound of distant gunshots, sharp cracks echoing across the prairie like the snapping of dry branches. Her heart pounded as she rose from her cot and pressed to the window. In the distance, faint flashes lit the horizon, and she knew the men were engaged in a fight beyond the pastures. She hurried to the kitchen, kindled a lamp, and set water to boil, preparing bandages as her father had taught her long ago. When the door finally opened, the men entered, battered but alive, dragging with them a wounded steer and faces lined with anger. Mason's men had tried to drive the herd, had fired upon them when challenged, then scattered into the dark. The following days became a blur of vigilance. Rifles rested by doorways, men took turns riding night watch, and the ranch seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next strike. Eliza, though fear gnawed at her, refused to retreat into helplessness. She carried food to the men standing guard, washed their clothes, mended torn shirts, tended bruises and scrapes. She carried herself with such quiet determination that even hardened Samuel muttered one evening that she had more steel in her than half the cowhands combined. The inevitable came at dusk 1 week later. She was gathering herbs from the garden when she heard the thunder of hooves and the shouts of men. Racing inside, she saw smoke rising from the barn, the glow of fire against the darkening sky. Without hesitation, she seized the rifle Jacob kept by the door and rushed to the yard. Men were already fighting, gunfire snapping through the evening air, figures darting between corrals. Through the chaos, she saw Daniel grappling with a rider near the barn, his shoulder still weak from an old fall, but his strength fierce as ever. Jacob was firing steadily from the porch, his calm demeanor belying the danger. Eliza did not retreat to the safety of her quarters. She ran toward the kitchen well, filled a bucket, and dashed water on the growing flames, choking on smoke but refusing to stop. 2 hands joined her, beating back the fire until it hissed into steam. When one of Mason's men broke through the melee and lunged toward the house, she raised the rifle and fired. The shot went wide, but it forced him back long enough for Samuel to strike him down. Her arms shook, her body trembled, but she stood her ground. By the time the last of the attackers fled into the night, the yard was scarred with hoof prints, the barn blackened with smoke, and the men exhausted. Yet they were alive, and the ranch still stood. In the hush that followed, eyes turned toward Eliza. They had seen her fight with them, had seen her risk her life to protect what was theirs. No words were spoken, but in their gazes, she read something that had not been there before. Acceptance. She was no longer an outsider clinging to survival. She was one of them. Later, as she washed soot from her arms and bound a gash on Daniel's hand, he looked at her with a depth she had not yet seen, as though the events of the night had confirmed something he had long suspected. She lowered her eyes, unwilling to trust the flicker of warmth that rose in her chest. Yet even as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The prairie had tested her with fire and fear, and she had not broken. Where once she had begged on her knees, now she stood shoulder to shoulder with men hardened by war and work. Respect had not been handed to her. It had been earned in sweat, in smoke, in the steady refusal to yield. But though the ranch had survived the night, she felt the weight of what lingered beyond. Mason would not stop with a single failed raid. His hunger was too great, his pride too wounded. What had come tonight was only the beginning. The ranch would need all its strength for what lay ahead, and so would she. The morning after the raid dawned strangely quiet, as if the prairie itself had paused to draw breath. The sky stretched wide and cloudless, its calm a stark contrast to the violence that had scarred the land only hours before. Eliza stood in the yard with a bucket of water, watching the smoke still curl faintly from the barn roof, where flames had threatened to devour everything. The men moved slowly, their bodies bruised and weary, yet each step they took spoke of determination rather than defeat. The Harper Ranch still stood, scarred but unbroken, and in the silence of dawn, Eliza felt the first fragile threads of hope begin to weave through the air. Her own body ached with exhaustion. Every muscle throbbed from labor. Every breath carried the memory of smoke. Yet there was pride in her fatigue, pride in knowing she had not faltered when the fire threatened, when strangers had stormed their land. She had carried water, raised a rifle, and stood her ground. For the first time since Thomas's death, she did not feel like a woman carried forward by desperation alone. She felt like someone who had chosen to fight, to belong, and to protect what was now hers as much as theirs. The men, hardened and often slow to show emotion, revealed their acknowledgement in small ways that morning. Billy fetched extra wood for her fire without being asked. Samuel tipped his hat with a respect he had never shown before. Even Hank, gruff and stubborn, muttered that her bread was better than anything he had tasted on the trail, though the words came with a scowl as if to disguise them. Jacob Harper's approval was quieter still, no grand speeches or gestures, only the way he set his coffee cup down with a faint nod of satisfaction. But Eliza understood. These men did not waste words. Their respect was in their actions, and now it was hers. Daniel's gaze lingered on her often, though he tried to keep his distance as duty demanded. His shoulder was wrapped where the fight had reopened old wounds, and his steps were slower than usual, but his eyes carried none of the weariness of his body. Instead, they carried something unspoken, something that passed between them each time they crossed paths in the yard or the kitchen. It was not the pity she had once feared, nor the fleeting interest of a man in need of company. It was steadier, deeper, a recognition that she had become part of the very fabric of this place. Days passed, and the ranch began to knit itself back together. Men repaired fences, patched walls, and tended to cattle skittish from the gunfire. Eliza oversaw the kitchen with renewed authority, feeding not only bodies but spirits, ensuring that each meal reminded them of the order they defended. The barn, though blackened in places, stood strong once more, its timbers reinforced by the labor of many hands. Smoke no longer rose from its roof, but from her kitchen chimney where stews simmered and bread baked, a symbol of resilience stronger than any weapon. Yet peace was fragile, and they all knew it. Mason had been driven back, but his pride was too sharp, his greed too consuming to let him stop. Whispers reached them from town of men being hired, of supplies purchased in bulk, of the Double Bar Ranch preparing for something larger. The Harpers did not speak of it often, but the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and inevitable. Eliza felt it each time Daniel rode out with the others, her heart twisting with fear until his return. Each evening spent listening for the sound of hoofbeats that would tell her he was safe. One night, as she washed dishes alone, she caught her reflection in the darkened window. The woman who stared back was not the merchant's wife from Missouri, soft and sheltered, who had once lived among bolts of cloth and tidy shelves. Nor was she the broken widow who had fallen to her knees in the dust, begging for bread. This woman's hands were calloused, her back strong, her eyes steady. She was no longer surviving from moment to moment. She was shaping a life, one earned through fire, sweat, and courage. The thought startled her, then comforted her, as she realized that the prairie had given her back something she thought forever lost: herself. The storm Mason promised came sooner than any of them had expected. At dawn, the thunder of hooves shook the earth, and riders appeared on the northern horizon, more numerous than before. Gunfire cracked, sharp and relentless, and the ranch once again became a battleground. Eliza felt the fear rise within her, sharp and suffocating, but she did not run to the cellar. She seized the rifle Daniel had pressed into her hands weeks earlier and took her place at the kitchen window, firing at shadows that moved against the barn, shouting warnings to the men outside. Bullets shattered glass and splintered wood, yet she stood firm, her heart pounding not only with fear, but with fierce resolve. The fight raged for hours, chaos and smoke twisting the land into a nightmare of sound and fury. Daniel, though wounded, fought beside his father with a ferocity born of love for his home. The men of Harper Ranch held their ground, stubborn as the land itself, until at last Mason's forces began to falter. In desperation, Mason himself rode forward, his eyes blazing with rage, his pistol drawn as he stormed toward the house. Eliza saw him through the haze of smoke, saw the cold hunger in his face, and knew in that instant that he meant to destroy not only the ranch, but everything they had fought to build. Her hands trembled as she raised her rifle, but she did not falter. When Mason burst through the doorway, the shot rang out, and he staggered, wounded, before Jacob's rifle and Daniel's blade brought him crashing to the floor. The fight drained from him then, his men scattering into the prairie as neighbors from surrounding ranches arrived to finish what the Harpers had begun. At last, silence returned, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the weary cries of cattle. Mason was carried away, his power broken, his hunger finally defeated. In the days that followed, the ranch became a place of healing. Wounds were tended, burned wood replaced, bullet holes patched. Neighbors came with supplies, with food, with offers of help. For the Harpers' fight had been the Valley's fight, and victory was shared by all. In the evenings, laughter returned slowly to the bunkhouse, cautious at first, then freer as the weight of fear lifted. For the first time, Eliza heard music drift across the yard, the sound of a fiddle played by one of the younger hands, and she smiled as the notes rose into the night. Daniel's proposal came not in grand speeches, but in the quiet of twilight, as they stood together outside the house. His arm was still bound in a sling, his face pale from healing wounds, but his eyes burned steady and true. He told her he loved her, not with flourish, but with the simple certainty of a man who had thought long and felt deeply. Eliza's heart stuttered, then swelled as she realized she loved him too, not because he had saved her, but because he had seen her strength when she herself had forgotten it. Their wedding was small, yet filled with joy. Neighbors gathered, men wore their cleanest shirts, women brought pies and preserves, and the yard bloomed with wildflowers gathered from the prairie. Eliza wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, cream-colored with delicate stitches at the collar. Daniel slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, solid and honest, and for the first time she did not compare it to the ring Thomas had given her. That old band lay safe in her drawer, a memory of what had been. This new ring was the promise of what was to come. As husband and wife, they stood on the hill where Daniel's mother and brothers rested, the prairie stretching endless before them, painted gold by the setting sun. Eliza placed her bouquet on Margaret Harper's grave and whispered that she would care for this family, this land, as if it were her own. The wind stirred through the grass, soft and approving, and she felt a peace settle over her heart. Life after the wedding was not free of hardship. There were fences to mend, cattle to drive, fields to tend, and always the chance of new storms or new enemies. But Eliza no longer feared them. She rose each morning to the crackle of the stove fire, to the smell of coffee brewing, to Daniel's steady presence beside her. She found joy in the rhythm of work, in the laughter of the men at supper, in the quiet evenings when she and Daniel walked the yard hand in hand, speaking little, yet understanding everything. She had come to the Harper Ranch on her knees, broken and desperate, clutching the last relic of a life lost. She had begged for a chance, uncertain if she would even be allowed to stay. Now she stood as Eliza Harper, a wife, a partner, a woman who had carved a place for herself in the heart of the frontier. She carried her past not as a chain, but as a foundation, each memory a stone upon which she had built something new. The prairie would never be gentle. It demanded strength, sacrifice, and courage. But in return, it gave back more than it took. Resilience, love, and the promise of a future worth fighting for. As Eliza looked across the golden grass rippling in the evening wind, Daniel's hand warm in hers, she knew she had found her home. The frontier had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was hers to shape, hers to live, hers to claim with every breath. And in the endless sky above, she felt the certainty that she was no longer merely surviving. She was alive, fully and fiercely, with a life that was hers at last. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.